We have a rare case in which both presidential candidates do better when they speak less. Well, you should never underestimate the ignorance of swing voters. Well, if you're doing all of this now, why didn't the administration crack down on the border during the last 4 years?
Welcome to Undercurrents, our daily news show from Unheard's Washington Bureau. Today's guest is Michael Lind, subscribed here wherever you get your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience of the show. Now, we brought you coverage of the Democratic National Convention as it happened and from Chicago. And in the hazy early hours of the morning after Kamala Harris spoke in the aftermath of a week-long party, I remember telling Freddie Sayers how starkly the vice president contrasted with Hillary Clinton on one key question: identity politics. And this is especially interesting, given that Harris is not only a woman, but also a minority, both characteristics she played up very heavily in the 2020 Democratic primary. Now, by contrast, in 2016, the DNC featured Hillary Clinton, appearing on a jumbotron, literally to the sound of shattering glass. Harris, though, is very conspicuously muted about her race and sex, rarely invoking it and daring not to dwell on the matter when interviewers bring it up. She invites the public to watch Trump rallies, she campaigns with Liz Cheney, she pledges to put a Republican in her cabinet, and insists on earning people's votes. When Harris sat down for her first major interview as the nominee with Dana Bash of CNN in late August, this exchange really said it all.
During the Biden-Harris administration, there were record numbers of illegal border crossings. Why did the Biden-Harris administration wait 3.5 years to implement sweeping asylum restrictions?
Well, first of all, the root causes work that I did as vice president, that I was asked to do by the president, has actually resulted in a number of benefits, including historic investments by American businesses in that region. The number of immigrants coming from that region has actually reduced since we began that work. But I will say this, that Joe Biden and I and our administration worked with members of the United States Congress on an immigration issue that is very significant to the American people and to our security, which is the border. And through bipartisan work, including some of the most conservative members of the United States Congress, a bill was crafted, which we supported, which I support. And Donald Trump got word of this bill that would have contributed to securing our border. And because he believes that it would not have helped him politically, he told his folks in Congress, don't put it forward. He killed the bill.
Now, compare that to this exchange between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden back in 2020 during the primaries.
Vice President Biden, I do not believe you are a racist. And I agree with you when you commit yourself to the importance of finding common ground. But I also believe, and it's personal, and I was actually it was hurtful to hear you talk about the reputations of two United States senators who built their reputations and career on the segregation of race in this country. And it was not only that, but you also worked with them to oppose busing. And, you know, there was a little girl in California who was part of the second class to integrate her public schools. And she was bused to school every day. And that little girl was me.
So did Kamala Harris learn from Clinton or from what could probably be called the woke lash of 2020? Or did that woke lash of 2020 force her to learn from Clinton? Michael Lind weighed in on this question with a sharp piece for us over at Unheard. He believes Harris is running a very competent campaign despite her word salads and appearance on Call Her Daddy, for example. And this is for two reasons, according to Lind. First, her strategy, and second, her opponent. Michael is a columnist over at Tablet. He's a fellow at New America, and he's one of the smartest and most honest analysts of Democratic Party politics in the context of American history, and he joins us now. Michael Lind, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me.
course. Now, some people would say that Kamala Harris's recent media spree, including appearances on Call Her Daddy and sort of flubs on The View, would reflect an incompetent campaign. But you make a really interesting case. You argue something different, that all of that actually matters less than what she's getting right in this kind of smooth shift to the center that she's undertaken. Could you flesh that out a little bit?
Well, to begin with the first point, we have a rare case in which both presidential candidates do better when they speak less and get less attention. In the media, their polls tend to go up. So that's a factor to bear in mind. In my Unheard article, I argued that if you compare the Harris campaign to the Clinton campaign in particular in 2016 against Donald Trump, she's avoided a lot of the mistakes that Hillary Clinton made, at least until the last couple of days. She was not running against Trump. She was had rejected the argument from fear, a sort of Operation Fear, in which many Democrats were claiming that if Trump is elected, he'll be a dictator, he'll create a fascist regime, et cetera. This appeals to hardcore Democratic partisans, but it's a turnoff for the public. So instead, she's been emphasizing policies, vague policies, but avoiding making it all about the personality of Donald Trump. And particularly significant, even though she is a woman and of both Asian and African descent, she's avoiding Hillary Clinton's strategy of campaigning as a first, as the first woman. Or the first Asian American president, or in this case, after Barack Obama, the second Black American president. That hasn't really been part of the theme at all. So one of the weaknesses of the Democratic Party is this heavy emphasis on race and gender identity politics. And the Harris campaign, I think, has been very wise and professional in downplaying that.
And I'm really fascinated by the difference between the Harris campaign of 2024 and the Harris campaign of 2020. Part of me wonders if some people would call it the woke lash of 2020 is what finally woke some Democrats up to the weakness that you just mentioned. Are they learning the lessons of Hillary Clinton because of the lessons of 2020? How do we, again, kind of put together what happened between Kamala Harris in 2020 and then 2024?
Yeah, I think that's a correct analysis. In 2020, it appeared that all of the energy in the primaries was on the cultural left, with candidates like Pete Buttigieg and Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders. And this alarmed Democratic power brokers so much that they arranged for those candidates to drop out, to clear a lane in which Joe Biden, who was seen as a more centrist figure, could defeat Bernie Sanders for the Democratic nomination. Now, in that campaign, in a very brief and unsuccessful campaign for the presidential nomination in 2020, Harris was part of the progressive lane, the far left lane. And so she's had a lot of reinventing to do since 2020, when she came out in favor of defunding the police, in favor of even defending race-based busing to public schools in the 1970s, which was such a disastrous policy in terms of its politics that Democrats had not defended it for decades. It was kind of a surprise for her to be using that to attack Joe Biden, who had opposed busing for racial integration in the 1980s. So this year, she's running much more campaign like Joe Biden did in 2020, as a middle of the road candidate who doesn't have alarming or weird progressive positions and has been tilting to the right relatively, saying that most amusingly that she has a gun, a Glock, and she would use it to shoot any burglar in her home. So this is, as an example of pandering to the right, this brings to mind John Kerry's, ostentatious duck hunting and church going in 2004. It didn't work for Kerry then, but we'll see if it works for Harris this time.
And I guess part of how successful it might be gets to or would be rooted in what she actually believes. And so, Michael, you followed this closely. Do you have a sense of which Kamala Harris, the sort of progressive lane Kamala Harris, or the tacking to the center Kamala Harris, or maybe a combination of both, is closest to what Kamala Harris, the person, actually believes?
Well, I've spent my life among politicians, and I deal with them very frequently. About 10% go into politics because they want to do something specific. They have very definite policy views that they refuse to change, even if it leads to defeat. The vast majority of politicians want to be somebody. They want to be governor or city council member or mayor or president of the United States. And I think Harris is a conventional politician. If you look at her career in San Francisco is one of the most left-wing cities and one of the most left-wing states, California. And so she took the positions of the progressive Democrats who dominate the one-party state of California. Now that she's running for president in her own right, she's moving to the center. Does this represent a change of view on her part? I think that's the wrong question. I think most politicians are looking at the polls constantly, and the vast majority of them, some of them don't care. Some of them will do what they believe regardless of the political consequences. But conventional politicians, and I think Harris is one, will change their views depending on shifting public opinion and on what they need to do in a primary election or a general election.
And is there a market, an electoral market for campaigning with Liz Cheney, saying nice things about Dick Cheney, and saying, I will, biggest difference between Joe Biden and me is that I will have a Republican in my cabinet. I can understand actually where in the suburbs in key states, let's say Wisconsin and Pennsylvania, some voters may look at that and say, okay, she seems sensible. But I wonder, Michael, to what extent you think that part of the electorate is significant enough to make a big difference?
Well, I have my doubts. I think most of the never Trump Republicans who were initially opposed to Trump, then a lot of them simply became disgusted with the Republican Party in general, and they've probably voted Democratic for the last couple of cycles. So I'm not sure there's a huge pool of anti-Trump Republicans still remaining that hasn't already gone over to the Democratic side. Having said that, it always makes sense to try to divide your rival party's base. So if it makes sense for a Democratic candidate whose progressive base is secure to go after independents and also disaffected Bush-style Republicans. And Trump, less effectively and efficiently, has been doing the same thing by trying to divide the organized labor base of the Republican Party. So I think this is politics as usual, but I think that the Trump strategy may be more successful for the simple reason that the kind of college-educated, suburban, affluent, moderate Republicans who would, like the Cheney family, would prefer Harris to Trump, they're outnumbered by working class Americans who didn't go to college by 2 to 3 to 1. The number grows when you include working class Hispanics and African Americans. So there are simply more working class Democrats for the Republicans to win over than there are country club Republicans for the Democrats to win over.
Immigration is something that you've written a lot about. So I wonder what you make of Kamala Harris's efforts to kind of convince voters that she's very tough. She's, we see this in some of her ads, that she's locked up illegal, undocumented migrants for committing crimes. And this has become, part of Trump's border wall was in one of her ads at one point. Do you think that she's done enough, or that she could do enough? Or maybe even the best way to put it is, has her strategy been as good as it could be on immigration, given the political climate for her?
Well, you should never underestimate the ignorance of swing voters. That is, if at this late date you're still trying to decide between Trump and Harris, then you are not somebody who follows politics closely. That's not a bad thing. It means you have a life and you're just not a political junkie. But so people, these so-called low information voters, they're not stupid. They just don't pay attention to. They might be swayed by this, particularly ad blitzes in swing counties and swing states. Having said that, on immigration in particular, Harris suffers from the fact that she's part of another administration, the Biden administration, which has admitted an estimated 10 million people under quasi-legal justifications, and in some cases tolerated massive illegal immigration as well. So this is the one part of the Harris campaign which I think is very vulnerable to the attack by the Trump campaign. Well, if you're doing all of this now, why didn't the administration crack down on the border during the last 4 years? And also by claiming you're going to be tough on the border now and enforce immigration laws, why weren't you arguing for this as vice president in the Biden administration? I think that's a fair question.
Now, the Teamsters posted some really interesting numbers of their internal polling that showed when Joe Biden was the Democratic nominee, the presumptive Democratic nominee, the gap between Trump and Biden was much smaller than it was after Kamala Harris became the nominee of the Democratic Party, which, the gap is massive. Basically, Trump has a big lead. What do you make of that, given the conversation here about how Kamala Harris has been kind of trying to seem a little bit more tough, maybe a little bit more centrist? Was there ever anything she could have done to step into Joe Biden's shoes and maintain support from, for instance, union voters at the same level?
Well, at the end of the day, it's very difficult because I think a lot of those union voters, they're voting on the basis of culture and class and values and not as union members as such. And the white working class in particular has been voting Republican more and more by ever greater amounts in every cycle, for the last couple of decades. So that's just a chronic problem that all Democrats have, including Joe Biden. He lost the white working class by significant numbers. He didn't do as badly as Hillary did. And the other problem she has is, compared to Biden was a genuine centrist. He was kind of a middle-of-the-road Democrat, conservative on many issues in the U.S. Senate in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. And he had this kind of exaggerated Scranton Joe working-class persona, even though his father was an executive and a member of the business class. But nevertheless, he had this kind of working-class friendly persona, and for no fault of her own, Harris is the child of left-wing professors who grew up in the upper middle class and then had a career in progressive San Francisco and progressive one-party Democratic California. So she just doesn't have that kind of legacy and persona of being a middle-of-the-road, working-class friendly person that Biden established over a lifetime in national politics.
Now, part of this equation also is Donald Trump's strategy on the campaign trail and the push and pull between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump. And obviously, Trump at one point said that Kamala Harris wasn't actually black, and he sort of tried to make what he could of the identity politics and maybe nudge Kamala Harris, bait Kamala Harris into talking more about it than her campaign wants to. But to what extent is the Harris campaign benefiting from Donald Trump's sort of freewheeling, I don't even know, politically incorrect, maybe is the best way to put it, approach to the campaign?
Well, they should be benefiting more than they are if you think about it, because Trump has been even less disciplined and incoherent and sometimes, borderline crazy in this campaign than in his previous campaigns, calling Harris who's a very business-friendly, pro-corporate Democrat, a Marxist and a communist, and ranting about Haitian immigrants stealing and eating cats and dogs in Springfield, a very nasty lie that went viral and made Trump look and damaged a vice presidential candidate, J.D. Vance, as well, for repeating this nonsense. Although Vance, I think, has recovered somewhat by his excellent performance in the vice presidential debate. But if you had predicted the campaign that a Trump-Vance ticket would take after the Republican convention, you would have thought they would be focusing on policies to win over working class independents and Democrats, right? And Trump historically has been the most progressive, if you want to use that term, Republican, really, in living memory, in the sense that he's tried to reach out to unions, for example, both in his first run and in this one. He's not going to cut Social Security or Medicare. He wants to eliminate the tax on tips. So a disciplined Trump campaign would have focused on these working class economic issues. But instead, it's gone the culture war route with the pet-eating Haitians and with the Democrats being communists and Marxists. And the only way I can understand this is that the people running the Trump campaign and Trump himself are just too online. There's this kind of far-right echo chamber online with these memes like the pet-eating Haitians and the Democrats being secret communists and things like that. And it almost seems as though the Trump-Vance ticket is trying to win a popularity contest on the alt-right internet instead of appealing to undecided voters in a general U.S. election. It's very bizarre.
And then on the other hand, they have this ad that even Charlemagne the God, is the host of the Breakfast Club. It said, they're running it during NFL games. It says Kamala Harris is for they, them, and talks about her pledge to the ACLU. This was back in 2020 to provide, I think it was sex transitions for undocumented migrants who were in detention, and a very specific niche policy. But I guess there is the flip side of the culture war coin, that when it's done right in a way that speaks to the concerns of voters, the Trump-Vance campaign probably has something to tap into there, given the vulnerabilities of the identity politics that Kamala Harris, I think, probably suffered from in 2020. What do you make of that dynamic, Michael?
Oh, I think it does make sense for them. That kind of the great weakness of the Democratic Party is the weirdness factor. So Tim Walz called J.D. Vance weird for praising one-earner families and stay-at-home mothers, saying that the childless cat ladies comment, which was unnecessarily rebarbative, but there was a idea behind it. But taxpayer funding for transsexual operations on illegal immigrants, that's a great red meat culture war issue, and I'm not surprised the Republicans are pushing it. Although it does remind me of a satirical poem from a satirical song in America in the 1980s. Teenage immigrant welfare mothers on dope. So the Republican Party from the Nixon era onwards has succeeded when it painted the Democratic Party as just outside of the mainstream on values for most Americans. But it's also combined it in the case of Nixon and Reagan and Trump when he was successful with softening the image of the Republicans so they don't seem just like they're the tax cut party of the rich. They're for the middle class and the working class. And I think the Republicans this time have done very well in the culture war side of things, but I think they've really fumbled the game in terms of having positive agenda for for working class voters.
That is so interesting. The idea of Nixon Tim Walz kind of trying to step into Nixon's shoes, but not really being able to pull it off given where he and the party actually are. I hadn't thought about that before, Michael. It seems like such an obvious comparison.
Well, historically, one of the jobs of the vice president was to be the bad cop to the presidential candidate's good cop. And in the Nixon era, Nixon would go out and be statesmanlike and friendly and smile, the new Nixon. And then his vice presidential candidate, Spiro Agnew, was making all of the attacks on liberals and drug addicts and welfare cheats and so on, while Nixon was above the fray. In the case of the Trump-Vance ticket, it's weirdly reversed. So J.D. Vance seems like the statesmanlike, above the fray candidate who can be cordial with his opponents. And Trump is performing the usual vice president role of being the belligerent attack dog.
That is funny. Finally, Michael, does this signal, at least the Harris campaign, picking up on the identity politics as a vulnerability, that kind of culture war, far left, the agenda that Kamala Harris intentionally attached herself to as a vulnerability? Does that signal a shift in the sort of Democratic Party establishment, which at one point clearly thought, and Kamala Harris's 2020 campaign was a great example of this, clearly thought that was kind of their ticket to popularity? Does this signal that they are moving away from that as a broader party in the future? Because a lot of people predicted back in 2020 that they basically would never be able to get away from this because they've brought so many true believers into the fold of the C-suites, the newsrooms, and even the campaign headquarters. But this campaign does genuinely look different. So are they turning a corner?
I don't think so. I think that they've turned a corner on the campaign strategy. So in the last few years, there's been a debate among Democrats with a lot of people favoring what is called popularism. That is, you run your campaigns on popular issues and you don't talk about the positions of your party that are unpopular with swing voters or voters in general. Now, Harris is clearly pursuing a popularist campaign, trying to avoid talking about things like transgender surgeries for prisoners and illegal immigrants, if she can. Having said that, does this mean their policies have actually changed? I'm skeptical. We'll see. But my suspicion is that the constituencies of the Democratic Party on the left that are committed to transgender radicalism and to phasing out fossil fuels as quickly as possible and various other policies that they're not running on in public, that if she is elected, then the same interest groups and activist organizations will be setting the actual governing agenda. So you don't get a real kind of shift in the Democratic Party until not only the campaign rhetoric, but also the governing agenda permanently changes.
And actually, I just do have one final thought on that, because I don't know if you remember, Michael, Randy Bryce, who was supposed to, be a significant threat to Paul Ryan in his district when Paul Ryan was still in Congress. They called him the Iron Stash. He was an iron worker, and he came with this full progressive suite of cultural ideas, in addition to things like Medicare for All and populist economics. Tim Walz was added to the Harris ticket because he fulfills this Bernie wing argument, or they believe he proves the point of this argument, which is that you can have bold progressive policies and do even better because people believe that you believe in these populist ideas. Walz, though, seems to have faltered on the campaign. He was never popular really outside of Minnesota. He never did well if you look at his electoral margins in areas outside of Minneapolis, I should say. So in a sense, I guess it seems like maybe the trajectory of Tim Walz is proving the point that you just made right here, too.
Well, the big problem that the Democrats face is their economic positions on old-style New Deal issues that are nearly a century old, like Social Security and Medicare, expanding and improving them, supporting organized labor, worker rights in the workplace. This has always been popular for generations and remains popular among many Americans, including many Republicans. So if they if it were a debate over economic policies, and the Republicans are opposing unions and they're favoring tax cuts on the rich, which most Americans don't support, then the Democrats would win every election. The problem is the cultural issues, rather extreme views on abortion, for example. Most Americans think that abortion should be legal in the first trimester, but support plummets when it comes to whether it should be legal in the second and third trimesters. And yet the standard Democratic position is it should be legal all the way until birth, which is a very unpopular position. And you can go down the list, of race-based affirmative action, of no consequences for illegal immigrants who, unless they are terrible, violent criminals, can sneak into the country and stay in the U.S. forever. These positions, these cultural positions or social issue positions, are constantly dragging down the Democratic Party in the way, ironically, it's sort of a mirror image. The unpopular economic issues of mainstream Republicans, like privatizing or cutting Social Security, cutting Medicare, not raising the minimum wage, cutting taxes on billionaires. The Republicans have often popular views on social issues, but unpopular views on economics. And the Democrats have the opposite problem. Their views on middle class and working class economics in general are fairly popular, but their cultural views are those of a progressive minority, and they're not shared by most Americans.
Michael Lind, that was so interesting. Thank you so much for joining the show. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
I always reference Randy Bryce. It's just a great reference point for me because I think this was back in 2018. Democrats were very excited about Iron Stash, and I followed it really closely because he was running in a district not far from where I grew up, and that campaign ended up fizzling. In fact, I went up to Randy Bryce at Netroots Nation that year and asked him to tell me about intersectionality. That is a true story because he was at Netroots Nation. It had just been talked about on the stage. They'd actually just had Kimberly Crenshaw, basically the person who created intersectionality as a theory, as a legal theory. She was on the stage. And to myself, I was thinking, would the people of Wisconsin really want Randy Bryce to be here just rubbing shoulders with people who insist on intersectionality, and everyone who disagrees with it is complicit in racism? So I asked him, and I think the question was pretty uncomfortable. I always remember that exchange because it's the tension between the politics of somebody like Randy Bryce or Tim Walz and the culture of the party. And I thought Michael's comment on the difference between rhetoric and the governing agenda of the Democrats, that while the rhetoric might be shifting, the governing agenda doesn't seem to be shifting, was fascinating and a really helpful way to think about where the party might be going in the long term, especially as some of these pretty far left cultural agenda items have really been mainstreamed. It's very, very interesting to think about all of that, especially given the conversations we've had on the show just this week about, somebody very mainstream like Ta-Nehisi Coates, or with Dr. Miriam Grossman about some of the tide perhaps turning on extreme policies towards trans medicine for children. Dr. Grossman said she thinks that she's optimistic. She thinks that a change might be afoot, similar to what's happened over in Europe and especially in some of the Scandinavian countries and the UK. So fascinating conversation with Michael Lind. Really appreciate him being here, and I really appreciate everyone watching. Thank you so much. Make sure to subscribe here on the Undercurrents channel. Please subscribe wherever you download your podcasts and over at undercurrents.tv for the full premium experience. We have 2 premium-only, subscriber-only episodes up this week. There's more content to come. We've been figuring out what everybody wants, what everybody's interested in, and hope to be getting more premium content along the lines of what everybody wants out to you soon. Thanks for tuning in. We will be back here with more Undercurrents on Monday.